Hi, this is Jim Clemmer. Welcome to our webinar on essential building blocks for leadership coaching and culture development. We have over 350 sites from 14 countries that are signed up for today's session, so hopefully you find that it's worth much more than you're paying for it. Well, some of you that were early, I had put up the questions that are really built around some of the main points we're going to cover here today. I will get through our agenda momentarily. But I'll invite you to think about which of these are most important for you. Is it around inspiring leadership across, up, down, through your organization? Is it about balancing both people and processes, leadership and management, hard and soft sides of things? Is it about expanding customer perceptions of value, elevating leadership, coaching strengths from doing pretty well to great? Or is it more that you're focused on strengthening culture and organization development? Now, of course, these are all interconnected, and I'm sure many of you are wanting to do all of the above, but we're going to, throughout the session, be coming back to what is it you're mostly focused on. So here's what I'm going to attempt to do in the next 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to leave some time for questions discussion, is to take about 40 years of experience, and hopefully it's experience of where I've been growing old, not just getting older, and trying to boil it down into 45 minutes. I liken that to being here in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, maple syrup country, and early on in my life when I was raised on a farm near Elmira originally, and then we moved from there. Sap time in the springtime was a major time of year, and the point was to take maple sap and to boil it down into maple syrup. And the ratio is roughly 40 or 50 parts to 1. So 40 or 50 parts of sap down maybe liters or gallons down to 1 liter or a gallon of syrup. So that's a bit of what I think I'm trying to do here today, is to boil down the essence of a lot of study that I've done over the years, a lot of my own personal applications around these ideas, as well as the extensive amount of coaching, developing, facilitating that me and our colleagues have done over the years. And then in books, this one goes back many years ago. I wonder who's that guy on the front. This goes back quite a few years, but all of my other books have all been attempting to boil a lot of this down. And it seems like in the last 6 months particularly, I've done a lot of this kind of condensing work. So one of the things that I also just did a little while ago was this is a screenshot from our website of the main keynote and workshop topic areas that we draw from and mix and match and bring together. And that's really, that was the first step at trying to condense, boil down a lot of this material. We also have done, I've delivered probably over 200 different off-site executive team retreats over the years. And again, have tried to concentrate that, bring that down to 4 main types of configurations, 4 main areas, which you'll see cover a fair bit of what we're going to talk about here today. You can also, if you want to get further into some of the background experience of where all this is coming from, here's another screenshot of the testimonials and feedback section of our website shown across industries. So if you want any of that kind of background, you can go there. Or if you want just a broad overview of what I'm drawing from here today, our website, which is a pretty large, extensive one, is divided into 3 major sections. So this is right off of the front page of the website. So the first part of my presentation, I'm going to be talking about keynotes, workshops, retreat kinds of topics, learnings, what are some of the essential building blocks that we've found are really key for those. Then we'll look at our more recent partnership with Zenger Folkman, which is now going on 3.5 4 years, and the tremendous depth of research, experience, and practical applications that they bring. And the third part of today, we'll take a look at, more broadly, at culture and organization effectiveness, and trying to bring you what are some of the key learnings from those areas. So in the next, well, now I guess it's 41 minutes or so, we're going to try to boil this down into lead, follow, or wallow, one of the basic frameworks that we use. Another basic framework is around balancing of management, leadership, and technical areas. and the 3 rings of perceived value that have to do with customer service. So those are 3 very key building blocks, foundation blocks, that will quickly take you through. And then we'll take a look at, drawing from the Zenger-Folkman materials, the whole area of leadership development, building strengths, and coaching skills development as well. And lastly, we'll finish up with bringing the 2 together, how we strengthen both people and processes simultaneously, and how they reinforce each other. Throughout this webinar, I'm going to invite you at the end of each section to think a little bit about some of the questions that we're posing here. And before the webinar is finished, you'll receive an email with these questions, with the link to where you can go on our website to answer these questions, and we'll send you back your response along with some suggestions, ideas of where you might want to go deeper into some of the areas that perhaps you're scoring a little bit lower on. So without further ado, let's jump right in, fasten your seatbelts, and let's get going on some of the essential building blocks. The very first one being around whether we are leading, following, or wallowing. And that comes from this basic position. One of the fundamental pieces we've used continuously for years is this idea that leadership is what we do, how we behave, not the role that we're in, or potentially the formal authority that we may or may not have. And so a subset of that then is that it's all about how we influence, how we connect, how we change, and how we deliver results. So that's kind of the beginning, very, very beginning point. So change then becomes one of the key elements here. And I think back to years ago, I was in a meeting with a group of colleagues, and I caught myself saying, well, once we get through this crazy period and things settle down again, maybe you've caught yourself in one of those kinds of meetings or conversations, and then I realized, well, no, things aren't going to settle down. And then not too long after that, I came across this comment from Warren Bennis, and he said he couldn't recall a period of time that was volatile, complex, ambiguous, and tumultuous. Then he quotes one executive as saying, if you're not confused, you don't know what's going on. I'll bet there's a few of us know what's going on, because it can get pretty confusing. So the key point here becomes, are we going to change and keep up with the rate of external change, or are we going to be changed? One of the key conversations we often have in these sorts of settings with teams and management groups is, how might we end up being changed? You might want to think about that a bit, or some of you who might be here with your teams might want to talk about that a little bit later. So let's go on then to take a look at a basic kind of approach that you hear people sometimes saying, well, that's not reality. Get real. You're not living in the real world. Well, there's a range here of reality, from the pessimistic side to the optimistic side, that can also then establish the kind of culture that we're building at our locally within our team, or more globally within the organization. So is it a culture rooted in fear and negativity and focusing on what's wrong, or is it a culture rooted in strengths and possibilities and focusing on what's right and how we can build further from there? So with that kind of background, and obviously I'm giving you the barest overview here, and in our follow-up we can give you links to go a lot deeper into these areas, but we use this fundamental model of which level, which framing level do we use, which pair of glasses do we put on when we're looking at change, either personally or professionally. Are we following, sitting back, waiting, seeing what's going to happen, hope it's going to get better? Or are we falling back into the, on the following side above the line, we're hopeful and skeptical, just kind of below, we're a little more cynical. Or if we go further to the top end of this model, we're climbing the stairs, again, leadership is an action, not a position, towards how can we capitalize, work around, overcome, deal with these issues. And if we're not careful, we can slide way down into wallowing territory. Here we go again. They, that proverbial famous they are out to get us. Who is they in your group or your team or organization? The danger down here is that we end up spending way too much time in pity city, riding on the bitter bus, down helpless highway, past pessimism place, whining way, dead end drive, through frown town, all the way into pity city, where there's no hope, there's no way, nobody's going to bother anyway, we may as well just forget about it. Well, that's a very quick overview of an area we often spend certainly more time in, but we start to get to the so what part of this. So what does this mean? Well, it means that as individuals or teams or organizations, we need to be able to step back and recognize when we're in leading mode, when we're in following mode, and when we're in wallowing mode. And what does that look like for us, whether it's at a senior executive level, whether it's at a middle management, or it's at the front lines? What exactly does that look like, or if it's for me individually? And then as I recognize what that looks like and what that means, then another key question, couple of questions becomes, well, how do I keep myself, or how do we help our colleagues or help each other spend more time in leading mode and not have a lot of time in pity city having a good old pity party? So as we leave this section, I'll leave you with the thoughts of Daniel Boone as you think about, well, where are you in those three areas, leading, following, or wallowing? Daniel Boone, the great frontiersman, once said he was never lost, but he was bewildered once for 3 days. Well, of course, being a he-man, he wasn't kind to ask for directions either. So there's one fundamental piece. Where are we at? What's the framework we're using? How are we looking at change? Then we move on to the next key piece, which is the balancing here of 3 key areas. What we do, the technologies that we use, and technical expertise, which in some organizations is very deep and extensive. How we use that technology or that expertise, the structures, the processes, the approaches, the systems, the methods, the tools that help all of that to work. And then at the base, deliberately at the base of this triangle, is this fuzzy term of leadership, or the whole people component. So our goal here is to bring together the hands, the head, and the heart. Or another way of looking at the 2 key components of this, if we pull out these 2, management is all about thinking and planning and analysis and rational logic and so on. And leadership is all about feelings and emotions and connections and values. Both of these are absolutely critical. This is not saying one is more important than the other, but leadership tends to be the base we want to build upon. And another way of distinguishing these 2 is to talk about IQ, or our intellectual ability, with EQ, or emotional intelligence. And again, we need both of these. In fact, Zenger-Folkman's very powerful research illustrates the need here for both. Sometimes I go back here and I think about which one's most important. It's a bit like asking, well, which wing of the airplane would you rather have fall off? Obviously, we need both, but often the proportion is not all that effective, as we're going to see in a few minutes. But here we take a look at some of Zenger-Folkman's research, where they took a look at their extensive database of 360 analysis going over decades now with thousands of people, and looked at the ability to execute, which is defined in these 3 points, focused on critical tasks, accountability, key priorities, executing key priorities, with positive work environment, which is defined by these 4 points: being satisfied with the company, respect for the individual, being treated fairly, retaining top people, and reporting on ethical practices without fear of reprisal. So you look at those 2, say, well, all of that's important. Now, here's what Zenger-Folkman found, that if an organization or a team is strong in ability to execute, that is at the 75th percentile is rated there, but not so strong at the positive work environment, not that it's horrible, maybe around the 50th percentile, then the chances they're going to be an extraordinary organization is only 9%. If the reverse is true, so a strong and positive work environment, not so strong in execution, it's still in single digits, although it drops a little bit, but it's not going to be significantly different. But here's where things get really interesting, where if we were to do the straight math on these 2, we'd say, well, if both of these were strengths, if both were rated at the 75th percentile, then the chances of being in the top 10% of leaders, an extraordinary organization, is about 13%. Turns out, what the research shows is that it's almost 90% of the time When a team or an organization does both of these well, there's a synergistic impact. And of course, you think about that. The best leaders you know, the best teams you know, are able to do both of these well. So where do we go with this? Well, what becomes a fundamental block here, building block, is this kind of exercise. To look at personally or with a team or an organization to say, well, how much of my time am I currently spending solving technical problems, putting out technical fires, managing technical crises, using my technical expertise? How much time in management, systems, processes, analysis? How much time in coaching and developing and communicating and connecting with people? Was it a third, a third, a third? Is it 20, 20, 60, or the reverse? What is it, and what should it be? Now, I've done this exercise with thousands and thousands of managers across all kinds of countries, cultures, organizations, industries, and almost every time the pattern is I ask, well, how many people would like to spend more time on the technical side? Very few hands go up. How many want to spend more time on management, systems, processes, analysis? We get a few more people who want to do that. How many want to spend more time on leadership? 70, 80% of the time. That's the big one. So the question then becomes, why aren't we spending as much time leading as we'd like to? So we dig down deeper into this question, and as we do that, we take a look at, when you look in the mirror, rather than out the window and saying, well, all the reasons I can't lead are because of everybody else. It's my boss, it's the organization, it's the economy, it's everybody else, which if we go back to lead, follow, wallow, is clearly getting down into pity, city, and wallowing. So if I'm going to look in the mirror, what do I need to do differently in order to lead more effectively? Because, of course, the famous, it's become a cliche really now, of Einstein is if we keep doing the same thing and expect different results, that's going to lead to insanity. Well, here's a slightly different way of looking at similar ideas through the lens of customer focus and customer service. So how can we improve customer service? One of my previous books, Firing on All Cylinders, was heavily focused on the whole area of customer culture and customer service and quality improvement. So the three rings is a fairly simple concept that often is a very useful way to look at this. Our intention here, our goal is to drive the perceptions of value as broadly here as we possibly can. And it starts with the basic product or service itself. So if you think of a restaurant, it's a meal, it's a hot meal, it's a meal that's tasty and looks good and satisfies that basic need. But in a restaurant, there's a lot more to the experience than that. There's the ambiance, the atmosphere, the level of service, how quick it is, how responsive it is, do they accommodate families or not. So there's a whole series of other things, parking, credit cards, a whole series of things that add to the experience. And then the third ring becomes this, we think of it as the ring where we go above and beyond, often beyond expectations. Sometimes it's called the wow factor. Now, how do we get up to the point where people are saying, wow, not only was the meal good, the atmosphere, environment, all those things are good, but the level of service or care or attention or tailoring that I got made me feel like they were just out to satisfy me. And so we summarize that as saying the first ring is meeting requirements or specs. Second ring is satisfying broader needs. And the third ring then is this ring of delight. How do we delight our customers? And that tends to bring us all the way back again through a different approach, a different door, to the point of leadership. It starts to become absolutely critical. So for example, if we now draw again from Zenger-Folkman's research on looking at leadership effectiveness versus customer satisfaction, here's what we see. We say leaders rated across the bottom in 360 feedback surveys compared to the levels of customer satisfaction that those teams, departments, branches, parts of the organization deliver. And of course, we see this pattern. Or if we look further at this question, here's a question that's asked. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about the Extraordinary Leader Program. This question is asked about going the extra mile. So we see these people over on the left are scores of 5 out of 5. So people who've scored 5 out of 5. Well, those in the bottom third who rate their leaders, or the leaders are seen in the bottom third, don't have a lot of people scoring 5 out of 5, less than 20%. In the middle, starts to get up a little higher, but we get to the very end and we begin to see dramatic improvements in focus on extra effort. Turnover, similar kind of pattern. Outstanding leaders have much higher retention rates, half the retention rates in this and many other studies. And we talk about that as being the tip of the iceberg, because the real problem here isn't people that quit and leave. Of course, probably guessed it, it's people who quit and stay. And so here we see a slice of leader effectiveness, leader assessments from 23,000 leaders showing employee commitment levels being very low with poor leadership, being okay with good leadership, and being outstanding with outstanding leadership. So this was, again, a pretty quick look at 3 fundamental blocks that have to do with, are we leading, following, wallowing, what's our balance, and how's our perception, how are we impacting customers' perceptions of value. So in this follow-up survey that we're going to be sending you, we'll be asking you these kinds of questions. You may want to start thinking about this. Are you building leaderful organizations where leadership is an action, not a position, and everybody is leading? And of course, sometimes maybe following, but rarely wallowing. Are you trying to proactively change so that you're not going to be changed? Have you got a good balance, back to that exercise of processes, systems, technology on that base of strong, effective people leadership? And are you maximizing customer perceptions of value, particularly as you move out into the second and especially the third ring, which is the ring of volunteerism, which can only be reached through strong leadership, making people want to go above and beyond and provide outstanding leadership. All right, so that's our first section, taking a look at some of those essential building blocks, essential frameworks that then can be applied in a variety of ways. So our next section is going to draw from our work in a partnership with Zenger-Folkman. It's been a great partnership over the last 3-4 years, and one of the key reasons that we partnered with Zenger-Folkman was because of their focus on strengths and the research-based approach that they have. So here's some early thinking from, of course, one of the great pioneers of management thought, Peter Drucker, who left quite a legacy behind. This is one of the earliest notes we have. It's from a book he wrote that appeared published in the 60s, where he had an entire chapter devoted to strengths. And here's what he had to say. We can't build on weaknesses. We can only build on strengths. He called it foolish and irresponsible to focus on weaknesses, a misuse of human resources, because all weakness really is a limitation. Now, since that time, over the last 15, 20 years particularly, there's been an explosion in work around strength-based approaches and around things like positive psychology. So Martin Seligman, I'm showing one of his books here, and this book where he really began to outline more clearly the positive psychology movement. Martin's at the University of Pennsylvania, and he and his colleagues have spent years putting a lot of research behind statements like this, that the greatest success, highest living comes from building and using strengths. His more recent book is called Flourish, and it just continues to work in that whole area. Here's one of his colleagues did a research that was just reported on last year of over 1,000 employees across a cross-section of American workplaces, and look at the shifts that are occurring now. What we see on the left is focus on fixing weaknesses. Well, that, 2006 was pretty high. That's where a lot of people were focused. It dropped down almost in half 10 or 9 years later. And we see the same shift on the other side towards building and working on strengths. So this has led to these kinds of conclusions, and the study found that 78% of employees reported having much more meaningful discussions and feeling appreciated when they focused on strengths. They're more likely to be leaping out of bed in the morning. These are Michelle's words. And when managers focus on weaknesses, performance declines versus focusing on strengths. Of course, how many of us love the whole performance management and performance appraisal process? Because it tends to, we don't love it because it tends to be very weakness focused. So she concludes that there's only a 1% chance that employees won't be engaged if managers focus on strengths. But of course, what's been deeply ingrained in us for a long, long time is when it comes to improvement, training, development, performance management, whatever it may be, my improvement plan around fixing my weaknesses. I want to show you a quick bit of research that just shows how ineffective that is. First of all, we'll look at, there's a number of tools around now that are focused on self-assessment of strengths. And this is showing the difference between self-assessment, how predictable self-assessment is, versus assessment from others. So pretty powerfully shows that self-assessment is only half as accurate or half as able to connect to to outcomes as focusing on or getting input from everybody else. We hear sometimes as well people saying, well, but that's just their perception. That's not reality. That's not the reality of the situation. And yet as a leader, or as anyone trying to influence, again, leadership is an action, not a position, trying to lead anybody, perception is all you've got. In an ideal world, people would look at each of our traits, characteristics, skills, competencies, and assess us this way. What really happens is something stands out. So that something is either a profound, towering strength that overshadows other areas, and brings other areas up higher, or the opposite happens. It's a fatal flaw, as we call it, which sounds pretty harsh, that can really drag everything else down. So for example, this is the one exception to when we find working on a weakness is important, is when there's something that's really pulling everything else down. And when that's the case, here's what our data shows, our research shows from now 75,000 leaders assessed by over 700,000 people, is that we're way down in the bottom 18th percentile or so in effectiveness when there's a fatal flaw. But the good news, the flip side of this, is you don't have to be a superhero to be an extraordinary leader. Here's what happens when we have one strength, but not a profound strength. So this is when I'm doing okay at a series of things, but nothing is really standing out. If I take one strength, one skill area to the 90th percentile, look at the difference. Huge jump, and we can see the trend continuing. So when we get 4 or 5 strengths up to the 90th percentile, we can be in the top 10% of leaders. We don't have to be good across the board. We don't have to be the proverbial well-rounded leader that's good at everything. We have to figure out, leverage our strengths, and build on those strengths to take them to the profound level. So here's some data that comes from organizations that have been down this road now for some years. Singer Folkman began this process in 2002. So a number of large organizations have been working with for some time who've retested, ran 360s, subsequent 360s, and have now further data showing the kind of change that was perceived by everybody else in those leaders. So when the leaders were working on a weakness, good news is there was improvement. When the leaders were working on building a strength from good to great, they showed 2 to 3 times, in different situations up to 3 times, improvement in perceived effectiveness as a leader. So that then leads to the question, well, how do you do that? How do you build strengths? And one of the key elements here is the idea of cross-training as a way to really build strengths. In a nutshell, it boils down to deciding what to work on and then how to leverage that strength. So here's how to decide what to work on. Getting feedback, 360 feedback that says, well, here's where I'm seen as my greatest strengths by others. Here's what people see as the need for my role in the organization. That, again, is important feedback to get. And then thirdly, here's what I'm passionate about. Here's what sustains me. Here's what I love to do. So we call this the leadership sweet spot. And so this is to help figure out how do we get 3 to 5 strengths to the 90th percentile using a strength-based approach. Melanie Will at Laurier has been working with this process now for quite some time and has put about 160 of their managers through this process at the university. And she finds that this part we're just talking about right now has really been key to help people let go of irrelevant weaknesses, focus on building strengths, and to bring together those 3 areas of passion, need, and strength. So when we've done that, we've chosen what to work on, we figured out where that leverage point is. Well, how do we do that? Well, cross-training is looking at how we can take non-linear kinds of approaches, like long-distance running example here. So cross-training in long-distance running would look like that. When it comes to building skills, here's an example. CCTG, by the way, stands for Companion Competency Development Guide. And so if we take a competency like technical professional expertise, the research has been done to look at who's already at the 90th percentile in this competency, and what is it that they do? What are all these people who are already at top 10%, what do they have in common? What do they share? So here are, for this particular competency, what they share. So I can look at that now, and if I want to stretch my competency here from good to great, I can start to use this as a bit of a roadmap and figure out how can I zero in on one or two of these areas to cross-train and build that competency. This piece, I'll just quote here from Alan Harrison, the provost at Queen's. This part is what he and many others have found have been a really powerful way to map out and identify what are the skills or the competencies that cross-connect, that leverage the one I'm trying to take further. Well, you can learn more. If you want to get more on this, of course, our website has lots of material, but here are some other resources, a couple of books, and an article that appeared in Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. Well, I've given you, and I'm giving you, very brief overviews of what are much deeper areas. And of course, again, in our follow-up email, we'll send you links, and you can go back into those deeper or look at things like these books and so on. So we're going to keep going with some of the Zenger-Folkman work now around coaching and looking at, this is drawing now from their book, The Extraordinary Coach, who Marshall Goldsmith has identified as one of the top key books on coaching. And we'll start here with a look at a typical gap that we see in many, many organizations, where managers rate themselves as being pretty good at coaches. Their people that they're coaching, not so much. Don't rate them being all that great. In fact, often we see managers rating themselves in the top 75th percentile, employees rating them in the bottom 25th percentile. Pretty common problem. Well, there's many reasons for that. One of them is that we get confused many times between training, mentoring, and coaching. Or another way in this diagram that you could think of coaching is that it's facilitating discovery, awareness, learning. It's facilitating and understanding deeper ways of attacking a problem and leaving the ownership with the coachee rather than with the manager. So that means then we have to avoid some of these common coaching traps. Too many times coaches, leaders don't spend enough time preparing for what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, just framing, just a couple of basic framing of the conversation. Or the second one snares lots of coachees and leaders, not really clarifying what does the coachee want from the conversation, even when the manager is initiating it. It becomes important to have it rest with the coachee. That takes us then into, so who's doing most of the talking? Because typically that's who's owning the conversation, and often the outcomes is the amount of air time. We have a little acronym we use here, WAIT, W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? So if I'm the coach, what's the purpose of my talking, and am I talking too much? And there's a lot of my talking focused on giving advice and trying to help solve the problem, which means then that oftentimes the commitment to change is not there. We may not be exploring enough alternatives, and throughout all of this, I've made this point, but it becomes really key, is having the commitment to change rest with the coachee so that accountability and follow-through is not, how is my plan working out for you as your manager, but is instead, so how is your plan that you were so strongly committed to, how's it going? How's that happening? What else can I do to support you? So there's a four-step process. We call it the fuel model. that becomes one of these fundamental building blocks for good, strong coaching conversations. It's framing the conversation. It's understanding where the person is at, what's their current view of the situation. It's exploring where the coachee wants to go, as well as potentially the coach wants to help the coachee get to, and then laying out a success plan. So having that kind of framework and having some of the kinds of tools to help frame these conversations can be enormously useful and make for much stronger conversations. So to kind of put into a nutshell or boil down to a little bit of maple syrup for you, what is it that we've learned and seen around coaching? Well, that many leaders overrate. It's a bit like asking how many are above average drivers. That's when everybody raises their hand. And that way too often leaders do much too much of the heavy lifting and solving problems and giving advice and end up not having the commitment rest with the coachee. A lot of times employees have a real tough time identifying coaching. What managers are calling coaching is really maybe updates or performance discussions. The employees don't really see it as coaching. So there may be a lot of one-on-ones, but they're really focused more on day-to-day work. And long-term development or using coaching opportunities or building coaching moments is often not a key part of the process. Well, once again, we'll be sending you this link for some key questions then. So do you have an evidence-based methodology to really identify, to help leaders identify and magnify their strengths? So not just self-assessment. Do you help leaders to map out and leverage powerful combinations? An example would be driving for results and technical analytical skills. I gave the example earlier of driving or execution and of a positive work environment. So those are a couple of examples of powerful combinations. And do you have a process for building exceptional leadership and coaching skills and developing those strengths? Well, our last area we'll touch on is probably one of our biggest areas, and this will be very much a broad, quick overview. And it's looking at this interplay between how we build stronger people to build stronger organizations, which in turn builds stronger organizations to build stronger people. So that's where our tagline comes from. And it's also where we know that the critical X factor is leadership and culture. These so-called soft areas have a huge impact on overall effectiveness. And so what is culture? Well, oftentimes there's a definition, something like this, that has been used, the way we do things around here. We have a couple of variations off that. This is an interesting one to think about. Culture is the way we do things when the boss isn't around. So how is it that peers interact with each other? Or we do a lot of work in the safety area. We'll often have a variation of culture around this term, behaviors and attitudes that are accepted and overlooked or expected and rewarded. And of course, culture then can have a huge impact and does have, there's a tremendous amount of evidence showing that it has huge amount of impact across many of these kinds of areas. And so we see Southwest Airlines as a good example of an outstanding organization. Jim Collins in his books Good to Great, Built to Last is identified as one of the best run companies of all time. And Herb Kelleher, the founder, says here in this comment, it really puts it in perspective, I think, about how you can get, lots of airlines can get lots of other assets, but it's really the esprit de corps, the culture, the spirit that has been the critical reason that Southwest has been so phenomenally successful. Well, there's a lot of talk about culture change these days, but there's also lots of evidence to show that up to 70% of many improvement efforts, culture change efforts, leadership development efforts are failing, or a third to a half are succeeding. Depends a little bit on how you look at the glasses, half full or half empty, I guess. But one of the contributors to the problem is this bits and pieces approach that we are using in many, many organizations, where we have these programs and elements that aren't well connected together. So a fundamental framework or building block for us is our six key areas here around this compass model. So the first area has to do with our focus as an organization, our focus where we're heading, and the context or environment or values or culture that we have building us. And then we look in the North Star position, true northing ourselves around what is it that our customers are telling us, and our partners, those serving customers, what are they telling us? What is it we need to do to serve the servers, to serve customers? Then we need to be setting good, clear direction and strategy and dealing with all this problem of huge overload that we have these days where people's inboxes are overflowing and meetings are jammed up and there's way too many projects, and we need to get much better at pruning and dealing with all of that. We need to make sure that our measures and rewards are aligned to the other three areas and where we're trying to take the organization. And then we get down into key questions like, for whose convenience is this process or system designed, and is aligned and taking us to where we need to go? And lastly, are we building the capacity in the organization to take us to where we need to go, providing the fuel to get us there? So that's one fundamental framework. Again, we can provide you links to lots more depth on each of those and some further self-assessment you can do just around that framework. But another fundamental piece of this we find, well, sorry, I meant to add in here, leadership and management. These are showing the burgundy and the blue areas are showing the balance of those two. So part of how we can get there is to think about what are some of the key steps that we can take. So I've talked a bit about focus and context, or vision, core values, purpose, and mission. That's the first step. Then we move up from there into behaviors and really defining the kinds of behaviors that are going to take us from rhetoric to reality, that are going to reduce the snicker factor. Because of course these days almost everybody I run into has got a mission statement and core values, and they got stuff hanging on the walls or on their websites or and so on. But the real question is, how alive are they in day-to-day behaviors? And so this becomes an absolutely critical step in defining and following through. Then we need to look at, do our processes and our systems align with what we're saying is important? So for example, if we're putting up on the big banner teamwork, pulling together, collaboration, serving our customers, all of that kind of thing, then we turn around and we have individual performance management systems or reward systems or pay systems that are all focused on individual performance, there's a disconnect here. Our processes and our systems are not connecting up. Or if we're focused all about customers and customer focus and customer value, and we're not extensively measuring and connecting and tracking and taking good data around customers, there's a disconnect. So we need to look at all of the components that will operationalize the good intentions of steps 1 and the behaviors we're trying to bring about in step 2. Then we're ready to go to frontline staff. Now what happens way too often is we start around this step in many organizations. Too many times people like us are asked to basically come in and fix them. If we could just give them a training program, if you could just get them on side, if we could educate them and teach them better how to serve our customers or how to improve quality or how to work together better. But of course, they're following what they're seeing from their leaders and the kinds of systems and processes that they're working within. As Don Cherry here in Canada might say, or maybe Yogi Berra might have said, it isn't rocket surgery. How can an unhappy, dissatisfied employee who's not being well served by systems or processes turn around and produce outstanding customer service? That just isn't going to happen in most cases. And then our last step is making this part of an ongoing, continuous improvement, ongoing looping process where we're continually coming back around and continually going back through this kind of cycle. So that's a quick look at some of the key elements of culture development, how that's often brought together is where I'll start to wrap things up here. So typical implementation steps around culture development. One option might be some assessment work of some sort. Sometimes what we do, though, is we start right into step number 2, which is where we get executives into an off-site retreat and maybe do some assessment work at the retreat, or we may take a look at some of the assessment that had been done earlier and bring that into the retreat. And so typical kinds of things that happen that we find are really important in these sorts of time away. Usually it's 2 days where we spend some time back to the foundations and frameworks and building blocks that I've talked about earlier on. Here's a few that we've covered. And then starting to look at, so where are we now? Either, again, right there at the session or bringing in data that we might have collected ahead of time. Where are we at in terms of that first step on the 5 steps, in terms of our vision, values, purpose? Do we need to revitalize, renew, revisit some of that, or is that pretty strong already? What are the behaviors then? And how do we know if we're on track or not? And what are the signs, and what is it that we need to do to strengthen that? What then are the, we call them strategic imperatives, but the absolute must-do projects, initiatives that are going to help to move all of this forward? And what then might we focus on in terms of how individual executives or the team itself is leading this initiative and modeling the kinds of behaviors that we're talking about? One of my books was called Moose on the Table, and oftentimes in these sessions we come up with a safe, anonymous process to identify moose issues. Could call them elephant in the room, you can call them lots of different things. Kangaroo on the table if you're in Australia. But what are some of the key issues that we need to address in order to overcome or to deal with being successful around our strategic imperatives? That then typically leads to a framework for implementation and strategic imperative teams to start to roll all of this out, and then following up and monitoring from there. So what we find with retreats, I'm showing a picture of an operation here, is a surgeon once said, I can teach anybody how to do an appendectomy in about half an hour. It's a pretty simple, easy operation. But what takes years and years of training is what to do when things go wrong. Now, of course, this sounds a little biased coming from me since I am a retreat facilitator, but too many times we get self-facilitated or retreats that get off track. And having an experienced person there can really make a difference. So last couple of pieces that we look at around typical implementation steps is realigning, integrating. Because a lot of times we're not trying to do brand new projects or initiatives, but we're trying to align them, bring them together better so we don't have that puzzle piece problem that we saw in an earlier slide. And so that'll take us then into planning, implementation strategies and timelines, and then, of course, to establishing the sort of ongoing follow-up, monitoring, making sure that we're following through on all of these plans. Well, as we close out this section, again, you'll be invited to do a bit of an assessment on where you're at with your team, your organization's culture, and the impact that it's having. How are you moving towards a more integrated approach and away from that partial and piecemeal problem that's so common in so many organizations? How have you linked vision, values, purpose work that you might have done to behaviors and making them alive and real throughout the organization? Do you have a culture of courageous conversations? That's the theme of Moose on the Table. We have a way, a process, methods, a culture for having those tough conversations to make sure we're addressing key issues. And lastly, are you using a good, strong, integrated framework that helps you with your assessment, with your alignment, and with implementation planning? Well, there we are. That was just a little over 45 minutes, I think. And again, what my attempt here was to take a lot of experience and a lot of stuff over the years and the approaches and frameworks. The danger, of course, is that I've given you a whole bunch of, like drink from a fire hose. given you a whole bunch to look at. In these webinars, I always err on that side rather than not giving enough or spending too much time in one area. So giving you a very broad overview with the invitation that you can now drill down deeper into any of these areas or pick the areas that are really going to be most important for you. So again, here's what we were trying to cover. And I started off asking, well, which of these areas is it that you're most focused on? So in thinking about that, and as you get your assessment, we're going to ask you to complete the assessment survey, and then we'll enter you in a draw for one of these 4 books. We're going to draw for all of these books, a signed copy of these books. These are my 4 most recent books. So we'll have you enter in that draw. And at this point, we're going to have you, if you haven't already, been looking at any questions that you might have about some of what we've covered here. There is a question section in your in the control panel for this webinar. And at this point, I'm going to answer some questions that have come in and then invite you to look at or to send in others. So a couple of questions that have come in is, one is, well, we've covered a lot of ground, certainly have done that. How do we get started? What is the next step? Well, typically it is through that sort of survey that we talked about, and or getting your team together, starting to talk through, does this make sense? Which areas are most important for us? Of course, we're happy to have more of that kind of conversation with you as well. We are going to be following up with more resources that you can take a look at and that might be helpful to you. And we're always happy to have further conversation. But a lot of it, I've come to think over the years, is the starting point is sort of the judo principle. The judo principle is apparently, and I'm not a judo expert or haven't practiced judo, but apparently what judo does is not try to block an opponent or block the energy, but to redirect it. And so what are the pain points for you, your team, your executive group? What's keeping people awake at night? What are the things they're most concerned about? Is it succession planning, customer service, leadership, culture? What are the pain points there? And how can we use that as an entry or beginning to take us deeper into these more holistic kinds of approaches? Another one is, somebody else has just asked, any issue sharing the survey with my team? I'd be interested in their view of what we're doing. Absolutely not. In fact, I would encourage you, Cam, to do that and go ahead and share it and use that survey more broadly with your team. Someone else is asking, Linda is asking, building on strengths is great, but what if someone has a fatal flaw? And that really is the key first question. And our experience is that as you look broadly across all levels of the organization, roughly about a quarter of leaders have fatal flaws, but it's lower, higher up the organization you go, thankfully, and it's more a little lower down the organization. But if a person has a fatal flaw, that is where they have to start. Have to focus in on what can they do, and ideally can they use some of their strengths, so the feedback they get, can they use some of those strengths to address that fatal flaw is ideally what we're looking to do. Just reading through a couple of other questions that have come in here. Please give your advice on the ideas and application in public sector setting. It is somewhat different in a public sector setting. Obviously, the bottom line, so-called bottom line, is different, and political factors play in differently. And part of what I've found is very useful, I've done this with a number of public sector groups, where as we go through some of the process I've described here, at some point we identify what are the things we can directly control, influence, or have no control over at all. And that starts to become really important in the planning stages, because there may be some things that are either politically sensitive and we can't really do much with, or just plain outside of our control. So let's focus in on the things that we can either influence or might be able to have some kind of control. Another question is, how do you identify a fatal flaw? Well, this is a perfect example where I've run numerous programs with the Extraordinary Leader process where in a few cases we were doing self-assessments, but the process is really designed as a 360. And when you're doing a self-assessment, that's incredibly hard to determine whether you've got a fatal flaw or not, because our research shows that half the time the individual is out of step with everybody else. That's either because they're too hard on themselves and they underrate themselves and they overlook strengths they may have, or on the flip side, they overlook problems and don't feel like they do have a fatal flaw. And so the short answer to the question is, how do you identify a fatal flaw, is to get 360 feedback, but to get feedback based on not just ratings across skills or competencies, but as then compared to how important is that skill or competency for me in my role. That's a key part of almost every 360 I've ever seen that's missing, is that we get that feedback so that I can compare the skill or my rating of that skill against how important that is. May I recommend the recent book, Start With Why? Yeah, certainly Start With Why. I'm familiar with the book. I've actually heard Simon Sinek speak. And the whole point, I think of it as 3 key questions under focus and context. Where are we going? What do we believe in? And why do we exist? And he, of course, focuses heavily on the why. And there's been lots of debate over the years as to whether you start there or start with vision or wherever it is. But ultimately, I think you start with wherever the energy is, and you get the team and the individuals clear about where are we going, what do we believe in, and why do we exist. Well, a couple of other questions. Culture change starts at the top. Some recommendations on how to garner buy-in from senior management. Man, I wish I had a magic answer, the answer to that. I don't know how many times I've been asked that over the years. And I guess the simple answer for me is, where is their energy, or where is their pain point, or what are the issues that they're really most concerned about? And usually they are management issues or outcome kinds of issues, whether it's cost containment, efficiency, productivity, quality, service, etc. And so then it's trying to figure out, so how can we help them trace that back into these so-called softer areas and see the connections. Now, I found, again, this is my bias showing through, but if you can get an executive team off on a retreat for a couple of days, I've rarely seen where that hasn't made a huge impact on getting that kind of buy-in and understanding and awareness. But the trick oftentimes is, how do you even get them to that stage to begin to want to do that kind of work? And it may be through drip campaigns where you're sending them little bits and pieces and articles and blogs and things as part of education. It may be just biding your time and waiting for an issue or a problem to come up. We can help make those connections. It might be showing them research. Of course, this is going to depend on the person and what they're concerned about. But it's a variety of those sorts of things where we're trying to look for making those connections. Someone else has asked, I want to promote a safety culture in my province. Where should I start? Well, that's a pretty big one across the whole province. Our work tends not to be across entire systems like that, but across organizations. And again, it's back to the culture issue. But what's really been powerful, and the work we did years ago with Barrick Gold, where they had a huge reduction in safety incidents over 3 years, a big part of what they did is they made strong, very powerful emotional connections between safe, unsafe, what happens when people are killed or hurt, and just how critically important it is that we look after and make sure that safety is a key issue. Someone else has asked, are all retreats just 2 days? Is there some flexibility? Absolutely. 2 days is a common sort of length, but oftentimes we can do a day, maybe followed up by some things after that, if that's all you can get. Or sometimes it can be 3, and I've even done 4-day retreats. So there is a fair bit of flexibility there. 2 days is a process and a retreat that we've found does work quite well. So as we're winding up here, there's a few other questions. Just skim through. So looking at piecemeal application, what are the steps to changing a piecemeal kind of approach? And related to that is overload, that everybody is in this massive overload state. I was with a team a couple of weeks ago, actually, where this was a very big problem, where they were just piling on projects after projects and nothing was being taken away. And one of the things that they began to do, now they're just in the early stages of this, but I've seen it work quite well in other organizations, is starting to inventory all the meetings, all the project teams, all the major initiatives that are underway in the organization, and beginning to figure out how can we prune out a lot of that stuff, and how can we realign it so that we're not spending so much time in dealing with those sorts of things. I guess one last question, I'm just reading it now, is put in place changes in the management team. Our next steps are discuss the desired state. As a facilitator, how do I get the group focused on more than just a communication plan and training? How do we help our leadership cultivate a mind shift, a culture change? Well, to me, the short answer to that is feedback. Finding a way to get either the team or the individuals, or ideally both, feedback on how their leadership is perceived and how important it would be for whatever the key skills or key behaviors are that you're trying to move forward. That's certainly been our experience, that feedback can play a major role in making some of that kind of shift. All right, well, I see a few other comments from some people that I know and saying goodbye and so on, and it is time to wrap things up here. So I hope that you have taken away some useful information here today, and that you've come away with either reinforcing some building blocks perhaps that you're working on now, or seeing potentially other new ones, or maybe even making some linkages across these different approaches that might be useful. We will follow up, as I mentioned, with email follow-through with the survey, as well as we're going to do a draw for those books, so we'll let you know who the winners were. And I'm always happy to chat further with you about any of this. Thanks very much for joining us.